So with the upcoming UFC 319 card, I wanted to break down the Dricus Du Plessis versus Khamzat Chimaev fight. And you have this being the middleweight championship in Chicago, both guys at 31 years old. You have Du Plessis at 6 feet even and Khamzat at 6'2". You do have the 185 weight limit, but in terms of reach, you actually have Du Plessis with a 1-inch advantage there. So I think that definitely could come into play in terms of their striking. And to look at both of their styles, you have Chimaev, who's a pretty fiery grappler with a pretty heavy freestyle wrestling background, but also has really good striking too. Usually gets a lot of early finishes and is just extremely explosive early on in the fights. And I would say out of the two, he does look to be the more technical fighter, or definitely has a little bit more proper form in terms of his mechanics. And for Khamzat, you have an orthodox style, but can be known to switch his stances. And even though Chimaev has shown really a lot of strength in terms of finishing guys super fast, I think at the same time, a common criticism for him can be that he does seem to gas easily and is a little bit more susceptible to heavy striking against tougher competition as the fight will progress. And also, I think another significant note is that he's never fought more than 3 rounds in his UFC career, whereas this, of course, would be a 5-round title fight. But for Du Plessis, you have him switching his stances pretty frequently and does throw a lot of punches from weird angles, is much more of an awkward fighter in terms of his form, but just can be really aggressive. And even though he has those heavy punches, he is pretty well-rounded as well with a decent grappling game, but most notably is known for walking you down. And I think a lot of his common criticisms are for just being a little bit too sloppy in terms of his form. And in comparison to Chimaev, just doesn't nearly have as good of a ground game, or is a little bit vulnerable to those takedowns, as his takedown defense is a little iffy. But on the bright side of that, I think he really has shown a lot of excellent stamina, can really keep up a high pace for 5 rounds, and has shown to have a pretty good chin, can really fight back well if he's hurt or in a bad position. And really to look at both of their histories, Chimaev, being the challenger, has never lost a fight in the UFC or in MMA. And I really think his record is impressive, 14-0, 3-0 in amateurs, and you have an undefeated 24-0 record in freestyle wrestling. So I think that is something that's really notable there. And of that 14-0 MMA record, that's breaking down into 6 submissions and 6 knockouts with 2 decisions. So I think a pretty even balance there. But just for the UFC, he would have a record of 8-0, 4 of those being submissions, 2 knockouts, and those 2 decisions. So even though not quite as dominant of a striking record, or only 2 of those knockouts coming from his UFC fights, you do have 1 of those 2 knockouts being within 17 seconds. So I really think that that is a clear sign that he does have power in his hands as well as his ground game. But really, I would say of Chimaev, what's really lacking here is that he's never had a title shot, let alone this level of competition. So I think this is a pretty big step up in terms of his overall resume. But looking at Du Plessis, you have a 23-2 record, and he is the current champion with 2 title defenses. But for Du Plessis, I would say a common criticism for his record is that he really hasn't faced an elite grappler, especially as a title defense. So I think Chimaev is just as much of a tough test for him than he is for Chimaev. And to really break this down even further in terms of just giving my overall analysis, for Chimaev, I think those 2 decision victories over Burns and then having a split decision against Usman is what is a little bit concerning here, given those are his tougher matchups. You do have a few moments where Khamzat didn't look as strong on his feet and did show a little vulnerability. So I think that's definitely a concern for how this fight could go in that direction, especially the longer it lasts. And for Du Plessis, you do have a few moments where he has shown struggle in terms of his grappling or takedown defense. And looking at that submission loss earlier in his career, I think that is a problematic sign for how this fight could go as well. But really the difference I would say there is that you had that submission in round 3 where the first 2 rounds were pretty heavy grappling rounds as well, and Du Plessis really struggled there but ultimately was able to hold on. So I think in comparison, where Khamzat is really dominant early on, especially in that first round, I do think Chimaev would have to be pretty consistent in terms of his pressure on the ground to submit Du Plessis. So I think for Chimaev to get a submission victory here, I think he would have to apply a lot of ground and pound or a lot of ground control over the course of 3 rounds rather than just 1 or 2. And I don't know if we've really seen that in terms of his resume. It looks like he is able to apply that pressure maybe for 1 round and then he'll go back to standing on his feet or vice versa, or just doesn't look as dominant on the ground, especially in the later half of those 3-round fights that he's gone. So really, to give my overall prediction, I think Du Plessis will be able to weather the storm early. And I think if he is able to survive those first few rounds, I do think he really is going to put a lot of fatigue on Chimaev in terms of his striking. And I could see him winning a 4th or 5th round stoppage, or even just really bringing it on later and getting a decision. And if I had to pick one, I probably would lean in the direction of a 4th round technical knockout. But I really think this is an excellent fight on paper, and you have both guys being well known in the UFC, and both have really exciting styles. So I'm interested to see this fight. I definitely think this is pretty much as 50-50 as it gets, but feel free to let me know your thoughts on this, and I'll see you later.